Acknowledgement of country. And I'm sitting in the southeast Queensland area of the region known as the Yugambeh language group, and I pay my respect to their elders past, present and emerging. One of our pieces of work, actually, the Community Attitudes to Use and Management of Biosolids, found that Indigenous Australians are actually more likely to be aware of the word biosolids compared to other Australians, and more likely to feel positive about biosolids use in their local area. So that's an interesting one. So the agenda for today, first off, we have Jen Martin from Arcadis, and she'll be talking about opportunities to enable conversations about risk with PFAS. And then Dr. Sean Thomas, he's the Principal Advisor for the South Australian EPA, and he's talking about the PFAS NEMP 3.0 that's been recently released, and it is out for comment at the moment. There'll be a bit of time for Q&A, and then we'll be finishing up in about an hour's time. So the Australian New Zealand Biosolids Partnership's mission is to support the sustainable management of biosolids. And we create resources so that both the opportunities and the risks associated with biosolids can be identified, assessed and managed. And this is one of these times where we're talking about the risks, potential risks of biosolids and land application. A massive thank you to our subscribing partners, as you can see on the screen. Without these businesses and utilities, we would not be able to put on events like this. And again, thanks to our two presenters today who have been able to this discussion on PFAS in biosolids. I've just got a quick plug for ANZBP. If you are not a member and you had to pay to attend this webinar today, it's a really great opportunity to be involved. It's interested parties. We discuss all different types of topics, not just PFAS, and you get access to the work that we've been conducting over the many years that ANZBP has been around. We can provide technical advice on biosolids management. We support communications between our member partners and provide networking opportunities. And I'll explain a bit at the end about our upcoming biosolids, the AWA ANZBP Biosolids Conference that's coming up. But without further ado, I'll introduce Jen Martin, who's the Technical Director of Risk Assessment at Arcadis Australia Pacific. She's only recently joined Arcadis, but has over 17 years experience in human health and ecological risk assessment. She's an industry supervisor to a PhD project developing integrated intake PBPK models for livestock exposure to PFAS. And she was formerly a member of the National Chemicals Working Group Subcommittee for Biosolids. Jen, would you like to share your screen?
Thanks, Kelly. Yeah. I have to wait, I think, until you've stopped sharing yours.
Oh, sorry. There we go.
All right, I think just let me know if this is working. Can you see it?
That's perfect. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Okay. Thanks so much, guys, for having me to talk today. And I'll try and go through this relatively quickly so that Sean can have some time to go through the NEMP. My name is Jen Martin, and as Kelly said, I work for Arcadis as a risk assessor, and I've been working in this sort of area for quite some time. Hopefully this will move. My screen is not, my slides are not moving, so that's not helping. I might need to, apologies, just retry that. Yeah, all right, there we go. So I think most people will be aware of what PFAS are here on this call. That's probably why they dialed in, but just in case there's a few who aren't, I just wanted to give a bit of a quick intro that we're talking about a large group of chemicals. PFAS stands for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, and they're used in a wide range of products, in consumer products, industry products, things like firefighting foams. People will have often heard about them being used in these, and they tend to have many of them tend to bioaccumulate or are persistent, and some can have toxic properties. The most well-known ones that we deal with are PFAS, PFOA, and PFHXS, and we do have health-based guideline values that Australia has set for these particular types of PFAS. And then I've just noted also that we've got Australia has a national environmental management plan that aims to give us guidance on how to approach managing these chemicals in the environment, and that's a piece that Sean's going to talk to in a little bit. So we often hear that everyone has some PFAS in them, and I actually saw the attendees, and I know that Jennifer Browning is here. So this is a paper that she was very much involved in. I'm sure she could add an awful lot more to this. But I guess what I wanted to highlight here is that, you know, we hear that there's very many PFAS out there, but actually we don't see all PFAS accumulating in our bodies. We are seeing that there is a decline in the level in our serum for some of these chemicals, particularly the PFAS and PFOA. But the exposures that we are seeing, they come from, the concentrations that we're seeing in our system are from our exposures in the general environment through those, you know, consumer products, food, water, dust, things like that. And we'll get to that in a second. What I wanted to do today was to maybe just give a bit of context of what does this actually mean in terms of risks to health. And to do that, I'm going to have a little bit just talk to sort of the principles of how we go about setting health-based guideline values. So bear with me for a second. On the right-hand side, I've got a figure there of with the effects related to intermediate or chronic PFAS exposure. That particular graph is from a paper we wrote a few years ago, looking at all the different studies that are available with information around potential health effects associated with PFAS. And this particular figure is for animal studies. So you can see that there's a wide variety of different types of effects, and they happen over a particular type of range. So with when we're looking to set a health-based guideline value, what you tend to look for is a level where there's no adverse effect, which is the little red dots or squares that you can see in that figure are all examples of where a no adverse effect level is found for a health endpoint. So it's telling you that at that particular dose that was received, they're not seeing any adverse effects to health for those particular types of health endpoints. So if you find that level, or if you can't quite find the no adverse effect, but you might find a very low adverse effect, you can use those from the studies and then apply safety factors to develop a guideline level. And that's what we have here in Australia. We have a guideline level for PFAS and PFHXS. For example, it's 20 nanograms of PFAS and PFHXS per kilogram of your body weight per day that you can have without ever having any real risk of harm to you over your lifetime of exposure. So there's a lot of safety factors that are used at a point which we already have reasonable confidence that there's a fairly low chance of having an effect. Sometimes in some of the other jurisdictions like the EU and the US are beginning to use epidemiological studies, so human studies. For example, I just thought I'd note the EU one has a health-based guideline value that's based on delayed vaccine response for PFAS, and that's based on levels that were seen in children at 17.5 nanograms per mil in children at about 5 years of age. So I want to just highlight that type of level because we'll be able to look then at, well, what do these health-based guideline values look like in terms of what might be in our blood, and what are we seeing in our general population. So if we were to look at the different guidelines that are around the world and convert them from a weight that you can ingest every day to an amount that might end up in your serum, what we can see is that for our Australian blood serum concentrations, we're generally below all of those health-based guideline values. So even though we do have some PFAS and in our blood and it's reducing, they're typically below those health-based guideline values. So it does mean that, you know, we're in a relatively protective space as such, and we're looking to reduce it because, you know, we're always looking to reduce our exposure to chemicals that might accumulate within us. And this really aligns with a lot of the studies, let's say like the ANU have done, for example, where they didn't see very significant health impacts for people with exposure to PFAS. So if we know that we have health-based guideline values, and we know that our serum levels are generally indicating that we're not quite, our exposure isn't as high as those health-based guideline values, or we're generally already sort of protected, we still want to know how might we be exposed to PFAS, because then that helps us understand where can we improve and put constraints in place or modify and regulate our environment to reduce exposure generally. So we do hear a lot about this much in dust, and I really quite like this infographic, and I'm going to have to apologize because I actually failed to get the reference in there, but I think Kelly, you might know, that shows how much we see in food packaging, for example, foundations, dust, carpet, things like that, and compared to biosolids as well, right? And the amount that's present in the products will vary quite a bit, and there's a lot of different types of PFAS as well. What's quite important is knowing how you're going to be exposed to these particular products and how PFAS, you might come in contact with PFAS. So ingestion is actually a really important pathway. PFAS, particularly the longer chain ones, are relatively poorly dermally absorbed. So, you know, we're not going to be as highly exposed if they're longer chain PFAS, if it's in things like lotions. And then the longer chain they're not particularly volatile either. So what we're really seeing is a need to think about, well, how are people being exposed to these particular PFAS? So the graph on the bottom hand here is looking at food packaging materials as an example. And what we can see is a very long line on the right-hand side for PFAS, PFHXS, for example, relates to microwave popcorn. So it really stands out as a particular type of food packaging material where people's exposure levels may be associated with an increased serum level. So what we see from research is that, you know, dust can contribute about 5 but up to 15% of your serum levels. Other food packaging materials might be a little bit less, sort of less than 3%. Drinking water and food in general still tend to dominate quite a bit. So there are pathways that we do want to continue to reduce our exposure. There was one paper recently around PFAS in rainwater, and I think one of the reasons it would have caused concern is because there is the new US EPA health advisory levels are very low. So the fact that we're seeing PFAS in rainwater then indicates, you know, from a US context that might be indicative of a problem. But in reality, when we do look at it, even though we're still seeing PFAS potentially in rural areas, for example, it's at about sort of 1.4% of our health-based guideline value, or about 14% of our drinking water criteria. So again, it's indicative of wanting to reduce the amount of PFAS that might be in our environment, but at the same time, probably not an immediate cause for alarm. So why are we interested in PFAS and biosolids? Well, I mean, if because of their widespread use and their presence in humans, it means they're going to be continued to be found in biosolids, and they accumulate into food produce. And we do understand that food in general is a pathway that results in us having PFAS in our serum. But there is some good news in this story. So how much is actually in our food supply? So FSANZ undertook a dietary survey most recently, and it was a more comprehensive update on one that they had done initially in 2016, where they'd done a data call. And what they found was that for our general food supply, PFAS were below the limit of detection, except for a small number of samples that reported PFAS only, so none of the others. So it was one egg, liver, which isn't too surprising, that detected some PFAS, cooked prawns, and tuna canned in brine. But all of these detections were below the FASAN's trigger levels, so they're below health-based guideline values, and they were also below the proposed EU draft maximum limits that are currently being considered. So what we can have some, I think, good comfort on is that the PFAS in our general food supply is actually relatively low, and really the aim of this is to be maintaining that status. In addition to the sort of the findings of the FASAN study, and bearing in mind we've been using biosolids for quite some time, there's other studies. For example, Rainer Lohmann in the US, who undertook some studies on milk at 13 farms that have used biosolids or have amended pasture, or are in the vicinities with in the vicinity of a AWF site, and they again found note of very, very low PFAS in milk. So we're not necessarily seeing a significant amount of PFAS in food in the general supply as a result. But I do want to note that we do see some differences when we have contaminated sites. For example, like at AWF sites, you can have localized issues where you do see higher concentrations. So what needs to be done, or what is being done? There's a lot of work that's going into understanding sources to aim to reduce inputs, and understanding their significance. Obviously, things like the NEMP are looking to support regulation of biosolids and ensure that they're used for their beneficial outcomes. And with regulation, I think we have to be aware that it's always developed to protect the most sensitive pathways. So because Sean will talk on this, I don't want to go too detailed on it, but for example, when you do look to set a criteria, you're going to have to look at all the possible ways in which that contaminant might reach the environment, and then find the most sensitive sort of endpoint and set the criteria around that, because if you set it there, then it'll protect everything else. That's important because we're not always necessarily using, for example, biosolids for grazing livestock. More often than not, in many states, it might not be used on food, land used to produce food at all. So I think these are things that we need to be aware of in the difference of setting a criteria and then the actual land use itself. There are several challenges as well that we need to be aware of, that when you set criteria, we have to make significant assumptions, and we always have to go with quite conservative approaches. But in reality, settings like livestock exposures are very complex and they can vary a lot. So this is one of the reasons why we tend to see much lower levels in the environment and in these food produce than we might estimate using these approaches. I think lastly, I suppose what the future challenges I would consider is, right now we don't have maximum limits in Australia because the levels are low and there's no risk to the general population as a result. And that's based on our health-based guideline value. But where we're seeing other jurisdictions like the EU setting lower health-based guideline values, then they are looking towards setting maximum limits. So the EU have progressed that, and so it does ask the question that maybe at some point the US will. But again, at the same time, I would reflect that our existing food surveys have indicated that the concentrations in our general produce are actually low. So key take-home messages really that PFAS are ubiquitous in the environment, and they are present in consumer and industry products. So they're always going to continue to move through our wastewater treatment streams. Our PFAS and concentrations are generally declining, and our daily exposure is probably about 6 to 12% of our health-based guideline value, which is a good place to be. We can only aim to get better. The health-based guideline values, it's really important to know that they are set at a point where we're really confident that the risks are low. So, even when we do see a minor exceedance of a criteria, it doesn't actually necessarily mean that there's an immediate serious risk. The 27th dietary survey indicates that our PFAS is low in our food supply, and it's also below even the levels that have been used settings even lower health-based guideline values like the EU, which is a good news story. So the priority really is to maintain that status, and that's I think where I'm going to sort of start to hand over and let Sean talk to the NEMP, because that's really the aims I think there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jen. That was a really great introduction about PFAS and risks and human health impact. We will hold the questions over to the end, I think. If you need to go off screen and pat your poor little puppy dog who's been barking, that's fine.
Yeah, so sorry.
No, that's cool. No, that's cool.
Out to try and keep her busy.
Yeah. Thanks again. Sean, would you like to? I'll share my screen, and while you get ready. Sorry, I'll put it up on the screen so I can give you an introduction. Is it on the screen? I hope so.
Yep.
Okay. Dr. Sean Thomas is the Principal Advisor for Wastewater at the South Australian Environment Protection Authority. He has 18 years of experience at the EPA in a number of roles and has worked in both environmental risk assessment and more recently, regulation of a range of wastewater-focused industries, recycled water and biosolids. Sean has been a member of the National Chemicals Working Group under the heads of the EPA, which has prepared the PFAS National Environment Management Plan 3.0. And we welcome, ANZBP has been very fortunate that Sean is really provides input, and he gives us his advice on all things PFAS. So thanks very much for coming along, Sean, and I'll let you share your screen. I'll just end my sharing. There you go.
Thanks, Kelly. So Doug's going to share his screen because we had some technical issues a bit earlier. Beautiful.
Okay, great. There it is.
Thanks, Doug. So yes, thank you, Kelly. Thank you for the invite. Thank you for the opportunity to talk through. I'm here to have a opportunity to present to you guys on the draft National PFAS Environment Management Plan that's out for consultation at the moment, and particularly to the biosolids aspect that I think flows on quite well from the information that Jen just provided. As Kelly mentioned, I'm a principal advisor at the SAPA, but I'm also heavily involved in some of the National Chemicals Working Group, in particular some of the work on biosolids. So next slide, thanks. I'll quickly just go through the NEMP and its development because we've currently got NEMP 3.0 out for consultation, but the NEMP originally started in 2017. And it's been led by HEPA, so that's the heads of EPA's Australia, and led through the working group under it, which is the National Chemicals Working Group. And the original NEP was actually led, the coordination of it, through EPA Victoria. We did undertake some consultation on what people thought needed to be included, and the first version was released in 2018. It's also worth noting that that first version was appended to an intergovernmental agreement, so that's all state and territories on a framework for responding to PFAS contamination. Next slide, thanks. Almost as soon as we finished NEMP 1, we commenced work on NEMP 2, because NEMP 1, although it was a really good, robust piece of work that covered a lot of areas, it identified some gaps that were still there. And we undertook a prioritisation process to address some of those gaps. And in 2019, we undertook some consultation on NEP 2. That consultation led to revisions to the draft, and we published a document that summarised the submissions we got and our responses. And then in April 2020, actually released NEP 2.0. Which has been a pretty well received document. It has had a lot of access, so over 27,000 unique downloads and reviews from over 50 countries. And so if you go to the next slide. So similar to NEMP 2, as soon as NEP 2 was out, NEMP3 commence some of the work. So again, we have identified some more gaps that we need to address. And the National Chemicals Working Group has been busy addressing these through what we've grouped as general themes. And I've just got a summary of the themes because a few of these will be of interest to water industry people as well. So theme 1 is looking at the definition of PFAS and families of PFAS and the different examples of how you might group families, and has looked at some international approaches to grouping. Theme 2 is providing some guidance on environmental data collection and monitoring and how you might combine ambient data collection and link it to land use classifications to inform ambient monitoring programs. So theme 3 is water focused, and the main aspect of that was being on the risk-based criteria and guidance for the continued beneficial reuse of biosolids, and that's the topic that we're going to focus on today. Theme 4 is soil, so looking at the behaviour of PFAS in soil, in particular looking at leaching, and we've done some work looking at some specific soil guideline values. Theme 5 is looking at resource recovery, looking at potential sources of PFAS in resource recovery products, focused mostly on compost. And theme 6 is a bit of a catch-all for a range of aspects that didn't necessarily fit in the other ones, but are generally joined under some site-specific guidance. So this includes some principles on approaches to remediation management, management of construction water in dewatering processes, which may be of interest to some people here, but also estuarine and coastal marine sediment guidance as well. Next slide, thanks. Which brings on to the topic of the biosolids in NEMP 3.0. So next slide. So the focus of the work for theme 3 was looking at the development of biosolids risk-based criteria. We really tried to build upon the guidance that was actually in NEMP 2. And so most of you should be aware that in NEMP 2, we spoke to the potential issues around PFAS for water utilities and gave some guidance on water utilities to develop a framework to try and minimise the contamination in their wastewater catchments. So in the work we've undertaken here, we've done a fair bit of work looking at state and territory approaches to biosolids regulation. And so this is both in terms of the general sense for all contaminants, and I've got some just screen grabs of some biosolids guidelines there on the right. And the reason for that is no two states manage and provide guidance for biosolids in exactly the same way. There are subtle variations amongst all, and some are quite different from the others. So we really wanted to understand approaches to biosolids regulation and how that would inform some overarching national approach to PFAS. We also had a look more specifically at PFAS guidance. And so most of you be aware that Queensland's End of Waste Code has PFAS criteria and has done for several years. And I think they're on to the second or third version of the End of Waste Code. So that is like a relatively mature set of regulatory guidance. We also work with colleagues in New South Wales who have developed a risk assessment to look at PFAS in biosolids to inform some guidance criteria, and I'll talk to that a bit later. And we also engaged with some key industry associations. So during this process, we met with ANZBP, we also met with WASA and Water RA, to talk through these issues and get their input on the work that we're undertaking and what they saw the big issues were, where the pressures were, what were their main concerns, and what were their needs, what were they looking for from this process. So next slide, thanks. And so what we've done with the biosolids guidance is not just provide criteria, we've tried to provide some clarity, especially around the importance of characterisation and on land application. And so with characterisation, we focused on the importance of the range of PFAS analytes to be included, including the importance of top assay to understand the overarching approach. We've spoken a little bit to quality assurance, quality control importance, and the need to manage matrix effects. And I think some of the work that's been undertaken by water utilities in Queensland has been really informative here, because they've done a lot of work addressing some of those matrix effects to try and make sure we get better quality PFAS data from sampling analysis of biosolids. We do, in the sampling guidance, reiterate that in terms of the number of samples and the type of samples, that really the existing guidance from each state and territory still applies. It's really the NEMP is providing some overarching guidance above that. So that's important, and that's a principle that applies to the NEMP in all aspects of it, and that the NEMP is national guidance, and each state and territory tries to pick it up and fit it within its regulatory framework as it best sees fit. So we've tried to continue that approach in this biosolids guidance. We also addressed some of the particular issues around land application. So the importance of characterising the site prior to application is quite important with PFAS due to its persistence, but also its more common occurrence. So having a good understanding of the site characterisation and how that would inform application rates is very important, especially the case where you have repeat application sites, which can certainly occur, to understand how the persistence and the mobility from the site is being managed or being observed. Next slide, thank you. And so I mentioned some work undertaken by New South Wales. So what the National Chemical Working Group has done is taken a human health and ecological risk assessment that was actually undertaken by the New South Wales Department of Planning and Environment. And they did that for the New South Wales EPA, and we've looked at it and adapted it to be able to be adopted by all states and territories as part through the process of HEPA and the NEMP. And what this human health ecological risk assessment does is it considers a range of pathways and endpoints for PFAS in biosolids amended soils, and it looks at it from the human health perspective, looking at a whole range of endpoints. So from the consumption of crops, meat or meat-derived products, but also drinking water. It also looks at ecological endpoints, so looking at the potential impacts to aquatic or terrestrial organisms, plus looking at some secondary consumption aspects from ecological receivers. On the right, you can see there a screen grab of a supporting document that's been released as part of the NEMP. This is seen as really important because this document summarises the key aspects from the human health and ecological risk assessment that have been used and to inform the criteria that have been developed, to provide some clarity to the assumptions that have been used, but also the process that we undertook to come up with this criteria. So if you can go to the next slide, I'll talk to the supporting document a little bit more. So all the criteria that have been developed were done using backward risk calculations, and we started looking at what was an acceptable exposure. Jen's presentation before was excellent in the sense that it talked about some of the things regulators have to consider when they come up with guidance criteria, and we do come up with criteria to make sure it is protective for all. And so that's what we've done here when we've looked at the key exposure pathways. But what we have done is also include 3 margins of safety that were applied, and we've included them actually in the NEMP because they can be adapted to consider a whole range of factors, and I'll talk to that a bit later. So the key exposure pathways, so the most limiting factor for both human health and ecological were milk consumption from grazing dairy cows and from secondary consumption, noting that the approach we took didn't necessarily account for bioaccumulation in secondary consumption. And the supporting document also talks to a framework about how this criteria can be applied. Next slide, thanks. And so this slide captures and shows the table that has the draft proposed criteria. And all of you would have seen this if you've had a look at NEMP 3.0, the draft that's available for comment. So there's a few points to talk to here that are really quite important. So it does provide some restricted use criteria. So this is similar to Class B in many jurisdictions, but not all jurisdictions have Class A, B, C. They can have different definitions. It also talks to an unrestricted use for biosolids, and so the risk assessment contemplated a use up to 50 tonnes per hectare. But we also note that unrestricted use isn't actually relevant in all jurisdictions, and I think most jurisdictions would apply a restricted use scenario. Now, if you actually look at the table, we have a restricted use, unrestricted, and what we're calling the maximum allowable soil concentration criteria, so the MASCC. This is important because this is effectively the goal, so the concentration in soil that the NEMP is looking for you not to exceed, and that this concentration is informative because it assists operators in enabling to calculate a CL bar, so a contaminant limiting biosolids application rate, to ensure that the actual application of biosolids is being done and not causing any impact. Now, the margins of safety I mentioned earlier are important. So the margins of safety during the risk assessment are really looking at different proportions of their the PFAS pathway in a diet for that particular endpoint. And we've included them because the National Chemicals Working Group thought they were a useful way to address a number of factors, and it would allow different jurisdictions to consider a criteria that was suitable for them based on a number of factors. And so I've included a few of them here. So there are some concerns around precursor chemicals, so precursors for PFOS, PFHXS, and PFOA. And so possibly some jurisdictions may consider a higher margin of safety might be appropriate based on precursors. There's also the potential for multiple exposure pathways. So this criteria is based on one, but there could be more than one. And there may also be some site-specific risks. But the margins of safety also allows jurisdictions when they are looking to bring in criteria, because as you'll all be aware, Queensland is the only jurisdiction that has criteria at the moment, possibly bring it in at the lower margin of safety, but flag that they would move at some point in the future to a high margin of safety. So it has a range of purposes, and we're very interested in input and feedback from water utilities and associations on the risk assessment, but also the margins of safety approach and how they would see that being used. Because we do think it adds a bit of adaptability to different scenarios and gives jurisdictions and water utilities opportunities to, you know, talk through some of those issues and understand how it might best be applied. Can we go to the next slide? And so this is my second last slide. So in addition to the criteria, we do acknowledge that there are some jurisdictional specific approaches that may need to be considered. So this is not mandated, but it allows different jurisdictions to pick these up where they see it's fit. So where we know there are known precursors for PFAS of concern, they may want to consider that. Some jurisdictions may still want to have a total PFAS criteria, whether that's based on top assay or TOF. And so the NEMP contemplates that that can still occur, although it doesn't set a total criteria. One of the overarching aspects, and this is consistent with all biosolids regulation, is that beneficial reuse is fundamental, and that is maintained through this approach. You know, regulators are very much like all stakeholders, so whether they're water utilities or farmers, is that we want biosolids reuse to be beneficial, so that the nutrient and the carbon source is a benefit to agriculture to lead to some of this green growth, and that it is not just a way of managing contaminants. So the beneficial reuse is key. It is important to note that we also have some jurisdictional specific requirements that may be called up, but not all jurisdictions would do it. So some may require stakeholder consultation. Some jurisdictions require specific approvals for biosolids application, but not all. And some also might have a reporting aspect that they require. So whether that's reporting on soil concentrations before and after application, or just reporting on application rates and concentrations in general. So the NEMP tries to address each of those points, not in great detail, but it talks to that some jurisdictions may require those aspects still to be covered. So next slide, thank you. And so this is my last slide. So the next step, so it is important to note, so this is a consultation draft. It's a draft that's out for consultation. That process is underway at the moment. There will be some overarching national engagement sessions that will be held. Each state and territory will also be holding its own specific engagement sessions, including the Commonwealth. And there will also be a number of industry focus sessions for some areas where there are some of the changes. And obviously the biosolids is a key one. So we'll be meeting with the industry associations and happy to meet with any water utilities. There's already some meetings already being proposed through each state and territory for some key water utilities. And strongly encourage everyone to log on to the Have Your Say website and provide a submission by the closing date. We are keen to get people's feedback on the work we've done, what we've proposed. If you have data to share, that would be really useful and informative. If you have risk assessment aspects that you think we could also include, happy to consider them as well. So very much open consultation, keen for people's feedback to get a useful position for us to take forward on the NEMP. And the next steps after consultations close is that the National Chemicals Working Group will consider all of the submissions, similar to what we did with NEMP 2. We will incorporate changes where we best can, and then put a recommendation to HEPA and then ministers at some point in 2023 for a NEMP 3 to be approved. And so that's it. So I think you can close the slide and I can hand back to Kelly.
Thanks so much, Sean. That was a really good overview of all the work that you guys have been doing. I have been trying to get my head around the margins of safety and looking through the supporting documents and working out what a common shrew looks like. So yeah, there's definitely a lot of information compared to the PFAS NEMP 2.0. Now we've got the supporting information, which is really helpful. Thank you very much for that. I suppose Australia-New Zealand Biosolids Partnership obviously will be submitting the request for comment, but during the consultation period, and I know the WASA will be as well. Just a question from just from me to start with, and then I'll get to the questions in the chat. Do you have any, like you mentioned that some jurisdictions may look differently at the different margins of safety, and the Queensland end of waste code is pretty close currently to the margin of safety of 1. Do you have a feel for jurisdictions and if they're planning to change their biocides guidelines after the NEMP 3.0 is implemented?
No, I don't. But we tried to be cognizant of Queensland's approach when we put the criteria together, and Queensland was at the table contributing to it. So, you know, I think we tried to enable some consistency with the Queensland approach, but also, I guess, enable some flexibility to enable other jurisdictions to enter this space where they currently aren't active, basically.
Right. Sorry, I've just lost my Zoom. Oh, here we go. I'll get to the questions in the chat now. Sorry, something's gone wrong with my Zoom.
I can see the first one from Matthew, which I'm happy to answer, which is around sources of PFAS in wastewater catchments.
Yeah, that would be great. Sorry.
Yep. Yes, governments are very aware that there are a number of sources on PFAS in products, and that a number of them enter wastewater treatment plants from domestic sources. And so there are a number of initiatives underway to try and address that. And this is both from a voluntary industry awareness aspect, as well as a increase in regulation side. So from the voluntary side, There is I mentioned earlier an intergovernmental agreement on managing PFAS. And so that agreement actually includes a national position statement on PFAS, which was a statement put out to really put the flag to industry that we're actively working in this space, and industry needed to start identifying sources and taking steps to reduce their use where they didn't need to, because there are a lot of PFAS is not necessarily essential use. It's a chemical that's beneficial to them, but it's not essential. And the Commonwealth actually took a whole range of work engaging with industry associations in the last couple of years in that space, which was very useful. I think the biggest byproduct of that I've seen so far is the Australian Packaging Covenant Organisation has announced a program where they are looking to phase out the use of PFAS in a range of food packaging products. So I think that's a really great start from industry along that journey. And we hope to sort of have a similar sort of conversation with other big industry associations in time in that space. The other aspect that governments are working on is some regulatory reform. It's called ICHEMS. So it's Industrial Chemical Environmental Management Standard. And so it's a reg reform that's actually been in the pipework for a long period of time, but it's been designed to close the gap with industrial chemicals and environmental management. And it's looking to set scheduling approaches for different chemicals to restrict their use or set controlled endpoints on where they can and can't be used. So I think as that comes in, and I think the first implementation of that might be later this year or early next year, is that will be a mechanism with which governments actually have the ability to prohibit the use of some chemicals, which has actually been a challenging thing for governments to do with chemical regulation in Australia. So we're certainly actively looking in that space. So yes, government's aware, both from a voluntary and a regulatory approach, that we need to be moving forward there.
Thanks, Sean. Yes, I know we've had some of our tradeways customers that were using a surfactant they didn't realise had PFAS in it at all. So they were happy just to voluntarily swap to a different surfactant, PFAS free. So people, once you mention PFAS, they are happy to oblige. It's just.
And I think and your point is really interesting, is that a lot of people just aren't aware, and a lot of it's just an awareness raising thing. And so I think there's probably a role for governments at the import of materials, but also probably for water utilities with their trade waste customers around, do you understand what PFAS is in your mixtures? Do you need PFAS in those mixtures? Can you look for alternatives? Because like you say, you had a surfactant that was PFAS containing. It was pretty straightforward for them to find an alternative.
Yeah. Okay, I'll go on to the next one for Jen. From Lauren, it's her understanding that it's historically there's been significant variation in PFAS measurements due to variation, lack of standardization in analysis methods. I think Sean touched on some of that as well, which creates uncertainty in interpretation of data. Have we reached a point yet where we can confidently compare biosolids PFAS results from different labs and states?
And I will actually also probably, I'd say Sean, this is across this nearly more across this than I would be, but certainly I know with the NEMP3 there is some recommendations around the difficulties, I suppose, of analysing biosolids, and some advice on how to approach it more. I guess with anything, obviously there's been an evolution with all environmental sampling of PFAS over the years. So when we're looking at historical data, we just sort of have to be quite cognizant of it over time. I probably am quite across what's happening right now between one state and the next as to the different approaches from a sampling point of view. But there was certainly, as Sean said, a lot of work done by Queensland looking into this to try and get to the bottom of what some of the issues were. So hopefully they're captured through the NEMP3 with a bit more clarity.
Thank you. Another one from Lauren. You might have seen this, Sean. December 20 is quite a tight deadline for submissions, given some state regulators have not commenced consultation yet and may not do so until November. So it's challenging for utilities to assess potential implications of the NEMP at this stage. What's driving the timeframe, and is there any appetite to extend it?
I think part of the drive for the timeframe was trying to not go over the Christmas January period. So we tried to give it around a 3-month period. We were somewhat stymied early in the consultation because it was proposed to be released very early in September. And then the death of Her Majesty the Queen actually came on the day that we were due to release. And that led to a temporary ban on any release of information during the mourning period. So that did impact us a little bit early on. So I think, we're hoping to, and certainly you should be seeing some conversations from state and territory regulators, as well as the national stuff from now. So we're hoping very much to be able to engage over the next bit over 2 months to give people enough information and to have those conversations such that we can complete the consultation by 20th of December. I think we're open to requests if people absolutely can't get a submission in that captures their concerns. And I guess we'll address them on their merits. But we're certainly hoping to get it done before Christmas, because then you enter the Christmas New Year period and then everything just kind of blows out considerably.
Okay, thank you. I'll come back to that next one from Lauren. She's been active in the chat. Thanks, Lauren. We've got Rob from Watercare New Zealand. He's asking if the New Zealand EPA has been involved. There's nothing on their website, and the water sector hasn't heard anything. And Watercare is our only ANZBP member from New Zealand.
New Zealand wasn't involved in the actual development of the criteria, but they've been part of the National Chemical Working Group meetings where they were discussed, and we agreed to put it out for consultation. I know they're aware of some work going on in New Zealand to understand concentrations, but yes, so they're aware, and certainly we're part of the group that supported it going out for consultation.
Mm-hmm. And I know food safety is Australia and New Zealand as well, so the guidance would be both countries. From an anonymous attendee, is there an estimate of this? This is a difficult one. An estimate of the tonnage of biosolids previously applied to agricultural soils that, after this NEMP, will need to go to thermal destruction or landfill disposal.
I don't. That actually might be a question best answered by some industry representatives, but I do think we're trying to set some flexibility in the system to allow jurisdictions to adopt an approach, to work with utilities, but also work with landholders and farmers to make sure they're also supportive of the approach and the criteria. From the data, when we engaged during the development, it was actually useful, and I think it was the ANZBP interaction that helped benefit this the most. So thank you, Kelly, to you and your team. But we did get a lot of data from a whole range of utilities, and I think for the vast majority of wastewater treatment plants, they would fit within the framework such that biosolids reuse could occur that's still beneficial. There are a few outliers there where they did have higher concentrations, and I think they may need to be looking at that. And there might be some utilities where their use and application is greater than what's contemplated in the biosolids guidance that we've prepared. So they might need to look at alternatives, but they also might need to do some more detailed site-specific risk assessment work to inform whether their actual application approach is safe and doesn't cause impacts to sensitive endpoints in the system.
Thank you. Yeah, I know in Queensland we've been working under that end of waste code for a while, so we're still able to land apply our solids, but I know some water utilities appear to be hamstrung by some of the limits. I've got a question from Matt Wood. In what human health limits were used in the NEMP3 back calculations? Do you know that off the top of your head, or should we just tell him to delve into those supporting documents?
So yes, delve into the supporting document, but effectively we were looking at the TDI, right? So we were looking at, similar to what Jen was talking about earlier, we were looking at the food standards TDI, and that sets a safe limit, and that was the limit that was used back to sort of calculate back what a concentration in biosolids amended soil would be protective of that limit. So the supporting document talks to the process that we undertook in that, and that included some transfer factors from soil to crops and analysis of literature there. So the supporting document covers that in terms of what was the criteria we used, but also what was the approach we used to contemplate how PFAS and biosolids amended soil may end up in milk from grazing cattle.
Thank you. Aravind from Southeast Water. No matter what margin of safety they use and what contaminant limiting biosolids application rate, at the end of the day, if the post-application soil values are exceeding the maximum allowable soil concentration values, are the application sites deemed contaminated?
So I think this is a question that's best dealt with at each state and territory level, because each state and territory will have a different approach, because it really depends on what aspect does their current guidance for biosolids reuse have in terms of interactions with site contamination aspects. So I think that's a conversation for Aravind to have with the Vic EPA on how would they perceive that, and how does the Vic EPA contemplate this framework being applied in Victorian legislation. And so that's, so like, one of the things I'm cautious of is I don't want to be saying what Vic EPA will do, right? I do think this is really important because we've been able to give an overarching impression of what's there and talk about the factors that we considered. But I strongly encourage all of your members to engage with their state EPAs on what's included, what their concerns are, and make submissions around their concerns and how they think it should be applied. And if they have any solutions to any barriers that they see, we strongly encourage, I guess, all utilities and associations to, contribute to that process.
Great, thank you, Sean. So unfortunately, we're running out of time. I know there's so many questions in the chat that I didn't get to. I don't know if either of you know if there's an increase or decreasing trend of PFAS concentrations in biosolids while I share my screen to wrap up.
Jen might have more information on this than me, I'm not sure. But generally, we are certainly seeing the concentrations of the big three decreasing because they tend to being used less. The complicating aspect with wastewater treatment plants is the potential for precursors. So you can have a greater amount of PFOA coming out of a plant than you do going in. And so understanding that is not as clear. But Jen, I don't know if you've got anything to say on that.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, I think we're seeing from looking at some of the papers in the States as well, they're beginning to see some changes as industries moving away from the big three and then seeing more of the short chains coming through. So I think we can probably expect to see changes over time. And as Sean says, what that means then ultimately, and through the wastewater treatment processes and how they may transform is going to be, I think an area that we'll still be looking at for some time to come.
Well, I'll leave it there. Thank you so much again, Sean and Jen, for the explanation of the PFAS regulations in biosolids. It's a hot topic, as we know, and there'll be definitely a session where we speak about it again at the Biosolids Conference in Sydney coming up in February. The conference committee is madly putting together the program for that, and thanks to everyone who submitted papers, very high quality submissions. So it's been very difficult to get the final program together. But thanks again to our speakers today, and thanks Duke and the AWA helpers Bridget for putting this on. I better wrap up now because I'm 1 minute over our time limit. And thanks again, everyone. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Don't eat
Thanks, everyone.
Don't eat microwave popcorn. Thanks.